Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Understanding Our Founders' Constitution. Well, folks, we have yet another controversy on the horizon that's starting to brew over the president's power, and I guess I should say we're not surprised, are we? This controversy has to do with whether or not the president has to go to Congress and get either a declaration of war or some sort of permission in order for him to engage in a military operation against the Islamist attacks upon our citizens in the Middle East, such as the two beheadings that have recently taken place. It is the contention of President Obama that he does not need congressional approval nor a declaration of war. There are others in Congress who are saying no, he does need to come and get our consent on this. And so tonight I want to take a look at this idea of declaring war and the authority or the limitations upon what the president can and cannot do according to the Constitution. Now, as a backdrop, there have been only 5 congressionally declared wars in our history. In 1812, we have an affirmation of a declaration of war against Britain issued by the Congress. In the Mexican-American War of 1846, the Spanish-American War of 1898, World War I, and World War II, we don't have a declaration of war per se, but rather a declaration by the Congress of a prior existence of a state of war. I think perhaps most of us are familiar with the famous speech made by President Roosevelt to the Congress, in which he asked the Congress to concur that as of the attack upon Pearl Harbor by the Japanese of December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, a state of war has existed between the Empire of Japan and the United States. And certainly I think that is very legitimately true. We were attacked, and therefore very clearly a state of war was in existence. A declaration of war to authorize the presidents to make war was not necessary. Now some, and therefore it was just a acknowledgement or a recognition officially on the part of Congress that yes, indeed, we were attacked, war does exist. Now, some are just statutorily authorized in our history. That is that, okay, we're going to take this action and we're going to authorize it by what the president's doing. In the war against the Barbary pirates by President Jefferson in 1802, this was the case. In our quasi-war with France in 1798, and in the 2 Iraq wars of 1991 and 2002. Now, come 1973, we had Congress becoming concerned that President Nixon, in the war in Southeast Asia that had gone beyond the scope of Vietnam, was becoming too, shall I say, freewheeling in how he was conducting the war, and that they were not having any control over what he was doing. And so therefore they passed the War Powers Act, which means that before the president can engage in any military activity, he can do so, but only for a limited time of 90 days, thereafter which, in order to continue that military operation, he has to come before Congress, make his case, and get their consent and approval. Most of the presidents, since Nixon and forward, have challenged the legitimacy of that act, although they have never really gone to court over it to get a ruling. And even though they have challenged its legitimacy as a control or constraint upon their powers, they have all acted pretty much in conformity with it. In 1798, another piece of history, we have the easy for me to say, right? The Alien Enemy Act of 1798 was passed, but it wasn't really codified into law until 2003. And what this act does is give the president the authority to detain and, if necessary, deport citizens of enemy nations, but only after a declaration of war has been declared or their country has made an attack against the U.S. And so therefore, those who are citizens of, say, some other nation who has attacked us, or upon whom we have declared war, those citizens may be required or declared basically persona non grata, which means they're not recognized as having a legal status in this country, and therefore they must leave. So, where does that leave us then with the idea of, does the president have to come to Congress and either get their approval, or does Congress have to initiate a formal declaration of war in order for us to deal with this crises in the Middle East of these groups of Muslims that are killing some of our citizens? Well, let's take a look and see what our founders had to say about it. Alexander Hamilton, and writing in the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 25, makes the point that the act of declaring war, a formal declaration of war, had pretty much fallen into disuse by his time. That therefore, this idea of having a formal declaration of war was not all that necessary. However, James Madison, when he was writing in the 41st Federalist paper, had the point to make that in all cases where power is to be conferred, the point first to be decided is whether such a power be necessary to the public good, as the next will be, in case of an affirmative decision, to guard as effectually as possible against a perversion of the power to the public detriment. And who then is charged with making sure that the public interest, the public good, the public detriment is protected? That would be the Congress. And in these powers, he lists that of declaring war. And so you see that this idea of declaring war was very much on the minds of some of the founders. In the debates prior to the finalizing of the Constitution, John Rutledge of South Carolina was not in favor of the president having the power of war or of peace. If we look at Madison's notes on this, he records the debates that went on regarding this issue that occurred on the 1st of June. And the thought of which Mr. Rutledge stated was this: Mr. Rutledge animated on the shyness of the gentlemen on this and other subjects. He said it looked as if they supposed themselves precluded by having frankly disclosed their opinions from afterwards changing them, which he did not take to be at all the case. He said he was for vesting the executive power in a single person, though he was not for giving him the power of war and peace. A single man would feel the greatest responsibility to administer the public affairs best. So they're talking about, should there be just a single individual as president? Or, as men like Alexander Hamilton and some of the others are arguing, perhaps there should be more than one individual as president. Perhaps a triumvirate, like in the ancient Roman Republic. Then there was the case of James Wilson of Pennsylvania, who argued in the debates that the president should be limited to executing the laws only, not for doing anything else. When we look at the original draft of the Constitution, this section in Article 1, Section 8, that says Congress shall have the power to declare war, the wording was Congress shall have the power to make war. It was only after the final debate that it was changed to declare war. This was done on August 17th, 1787. Let me read you just the notes from Madison on the debate, how this went. Mr. Butler stated that his objections against the legislature lie in a great degree against the Senate. He was for vesting the power in the president, who will have all requisite qualities, this is to put down insurrections and rebellions, and will not make war but when the nation will support it. Mr. Madison and Mr. Gary moved to insert declare, striking out make war, leaving to the executive the power to repeal sudden attacks. Mr. Sherman of Connecticut thought it stood very well. The executive should be able to repeal or repel and not to commence war. Make better than declare the latter, narrowing the power too much. Mr. Gary never expected to hear in a republic a motion to empower the executive alone to declare war. Mr. Ellsworth stated that there is a material difference between the cases of making war and making peace. It should be more easy, he said, to get out of war than into it. War also is a simple and overt declaration, peace attended with intricate and secret negotiations. Mr. Mason of Virginia was against giving the power of war to the executive because not safely be trusted with it, or to the Senate because not so constructed as to be entitled to it. He was for clogging rather than facilitating war, but for facilitating peace he preferred declare to make. Then on the motion to insert or declare in place of make, it was agreed to. New Hampshire said no, Massachusetts abstained, Connecticut said no, and all the rest of the states agreed to it. And so hence we have that Congress should have the power to declare war in our Constitution. Now it is obvious that in Article 2, Section 2, that the President is to be the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy and the militias of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. But nowhere in his being the commander of the army is any reference or mention made about him being able to initiate hostilities. Now we know from other parts of the Constitution that it is the responsibility, Article 4, Section 4, for instance, of the general government to protect each of the states against invasion and against domestic violence. The states are prohibited from engaging in war, according to Article 1, Section 10. It says, no state shall without consent of Congress, and it goes on to list several things. And one of the things it says is, they shall not engage in war unless actually invaded or in such imminent danger as will not admit of delay, which is indicate that it is the responsibility of the general government to protect them. But again, that is all defensive in nature. That does not say anything at all about initiating hostilities. And when you remember, where did these men come from? They came from living under a king who had the authority to go to war whenever it suited his purposes. Alexander Hamilton, as I said at the very beginning of our discussion, had made the comment that, well, the idea of formally declaring war had kind of fallen into disuse. Why? Because kings don't need permission to go to war. If a king wants to go to war, he goes to war. Therefore, there was no need of a formal declaration. But when a country's treasure, both financially, economically, and most importantly, the blood of its citizens, is to be put at risk, and its status in the world put at risk, and even greater, perhaps the repercussions of a loss of its freedom and liberties put in jeopardy, then it cannot be left up to one single individual to make that decision. It must be with the consent and the approval of those who represent the individuals whose liberty, freedom, finances, economy, society, and yes, blood is put at risk. And so therefore, it is my humble opinion that President Obama does not have the authority to just go off and do whatever he pleases militarily, but he must first get the agreement and the consent of those who represent us, the people, who will pay the price, both in money and in blood, for such an adventure. And so we'll see how this plays out. But that, I believe, was the intent of our founders, and why the only time the idea of declaring war is brought up in the Constitution, it is placed with the Congress. And that once war is initiated, it then becomes the prerogative of the President as the Commander-in-Chief to see to its conclusion. That, in my opinion, is the separation of powers in the area of making war. Let's see how it all turns out. Well, I wish you a good evening, and I hope you'll join us next week when once again we'll see what's going on in our government and what our Constitution has to say about it. Good night. Good night. Good night.